I don't expect you to believe me. In fact, it's probably better if you don't. Skepticism is a shield. It's a thick, heavy blanket that keeps the reality of this world from freezing your blood solid. But me? I traded my shield for a camera and a curiosity that had no business existing in a place as old as the Blackwood Valley. My name is Arthur. I was a restorationist. That's a fancy word for someone who gets paid to sit in rotting houses, cataloging relics before the bulldozers turn history into dust. It's quiet work. Usually, it's lonely work. But I like the silence. Until the silence started having a weight. The job was simple. The Vanderwall estate. A crumbling Victorian teeth stain on the edge of a forgotten township. The locals didn't talk about it. They didn't even look at the gates when they drove past. It was as if the house had been excised from their collective memory. The air inside the house didn't smell like dust or rot. It smelled like copper and ozone, like the atmosphere right before a massive storm. Only the clouds never broke. It was a pressure inside my skull, a low, constant hum that I felt in my teeth. I spent the first 3 days tagging furniture. Oak chairs, moth-eaten tapestries that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. But on the 4th day, I found the study. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it was locked from the outside. 3 heavy iron bolts, rusted shut. It took me an hour and a lot of grease to slide them back. When the final bolt clicked, the door didn't just swing open. It gave way with a wet, sucking sound, like pulling a foot out of deep mud. The room beyond was freezing. It was a library, but not of books. The walls were lined with thousands of glass jars. Small, large, some the size of a fist, others large enough to hold a human torso, and they were filled with everything. Hair, teeth, fingernails, strips of dried, graying meat, liquid that was too thick to be water, too clear to be blood. Each jar had a label, written in a cramped, obsessive hand. First tooth of the 3rd child, the last breath of Maria V. This one was an empty jar, but the glass was foggy inside, the liver of a liar. It was a museum of morbidity, a catalog of ending things. And in the center of the room was the book. It rested on a podium made from fused bone. It wasn't open. It was bound in leather that felt disgustingly familiar. It was warm. When I touched it, I felt a pulse. I should have left. I should have bolted the door and burned the house down. But the curiosity, the damned curiosity, made me open it. The pages weren't paper. They were vellum, made from something thin and slightly translucent. There was no writing, only maps, but not maps of places, maps of sensations, drawings of the human circulatory system. But the veins were connected in geometric patterns that made my head spin. Drawings of nerves, pulled taut like the strings of an instrument, leading into a dark, centerless point on the page. And when I looked closer at that point, I realized it was moving. The dark spot was a tiny, swirling vortex of ink. A whisper came, not in the room, but from the pages themselves. The sound of dry, rustling leaves forming a word. Arthur. My name. My name was in the book. I slammed it shut, but the sound didn't end. The jars on the shelves started to rattle. The liquid inside began to boil. The teeth began to chatter against the glass. It wasn't a portal. Nothing was coming through. It was just awakening. The rattling didn't stop. It became a rhythm, a discordant, maddening beat that resonated in the structure of the house itself. I backed away from the bone podium, my camera dangling around my neck. I didn't think to use it. Photography is for things you want to remember. I wanted to forget this immediately. The temperature continued to drop, my breath visible in the air, a white fog that seemed to drift toward the book, as if it was being pulled in. I looked at the shelves. The jars were no longer just rattling. They were shifting, organizing themselves. The jars containing hair were moving to the top shelf, the organs to the center, the teeth to the bottom. They were being categorized. It wasn't magic. Magic suggests a trick. a performance. This was fundamental. This was the raw grammar of the universe being rewritten in front of me. This was mysticism in its purest, most terrifying form. The van der Waals hadn't worshipped a demon. They had studied the architecture of existence, and they had found the undoing point. I tried to leave. I turned toward the door, and I froze. The door was gone, not replaced by a wall, not hidden by a portal. It was just not there. The wall where it should have been was seamlessly lined with more glass jars, filled with a viscous, black sludge that seemed to absorb all light. I was trapped. I ran to the shelves. I was desperate. I grabbed a large jar. It was labeled the bile of betrayal, and I slammed it against the podium. The glass didn't break. The podium didn't break. The sound was flat, dead, a thud that was swallowed by the room. Then, the book began to open. It didn't use hands. The vellum pages simply began to peel back, one by one. And as each page turned, the vortex of ink in the center grew larger. It wasn't a hole. It was a depth, a space that wasn't a space. I looked at it, and I felt a profound sense of nausea, not in my stomach, but in my mind. It was the feeling of a thought being unmade. The whisper returned, louder now, a chorus of rustling leaves. Catalog, or be cataloged. I looked at my hands. A thin layer of white mold was growing on my skin. It wasn't external. It was erupting from my pores. The cataloging had begun. I was no longer the restorator. I was the object. The mold, it wasn't soft. It didn't feel like the fuzzy rut you find on a forgotten loaf of bread. It was cold. It was hard, like tiny crystals of salt or crushed bone pushing through my skin from the inside. I clawed at my forearm. The white crust didn't flake off. It cracked. A dry, brittle sound that echoed in the silent room. Underneath, there was no blood, just a pale gray tissue that looked like wax. I looked at my camera. The lens was clouded, not with steam, but with the same crystalline growth. The machine was being converted. The house was reclaiming the materials. Stop, I croaked. My voice was a rattle of dry stones. The book on the podium didn't stop. It flipped another page. The drawing on this one was me. It was a perfect anatomical sketch of my own body, but it was being dissected by lines of geometry, triangles piercing my lungs, circles encompassing my joints, and the ink, the black, swirling ink from the center of the book, was leaking. It wasn't dripping onto the floor. It was flowing upward. It defied gravity, snaking through the air like a thin, black ribbon of smoke, heading straight for my chest. I tried to move, to run to the corner of the room, but my legs felt heavy. I looked down. My boots were fusing with the bronze plates of the floor. The leather was turning to metal. My socks were becoming wire. The mysticism of the van der Waals wasn't about gods or demons. It was about symmetry. They believed that the soul was just a messy, disorganized thought, and that the universe wanted everything to be neat, categorized, labeled, stored. I was being turned into a specimen. The black ribbon of ink touched my shirt. It didn't burn. It was freezing. A cold so intense it felt like a needle being driven into my heart. I watched, paralyzed, as the ink began to write on my own skin. It was drafting a label, the observer of the ending. The jars on the shelves began to glow. A faint, sickly green light emitted from the teeth, the hair, the bile. They were witnessing my transformation. They were the audience for my extinction. I reached out, my fingers stiffening, and grabbed the edge of the bone podium. I wanted tipping it over. I wanted to break the ritual, but the bone wasn't cold anymore. It was throbbing. It felt like a giant, calcified heart. And then, I heard the first crack. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the jars. It was my own ribs. They were shifting, aligning, forming a perfect, crystalline cage. Pain is a funny thing. When it's sharp, you scream. When it's dull, you moan. But when it's geometric, you just go silent. My body was being rearranged. I could feel my muscles being pulled taut, like the strings of a piano, being tuned to a frequency I couldn't hear. My vision began to fracture. I wasn't seeing one room anymore. I was seeing the room from 1,000 different angles at once. I saw the back of my own head. I saw the inside of my own stomach. I saw the atoms of the air vibrating in a frantic, rhythmic dance. The room was no longer a room. It was a machine, a massive, spiritual centrifuge designed to separate the I from the me. The whisper in the room grew into a roar. It wasn't words anymore. It was a tone, a single, vibrating note that demanded total surrender. "I am still here," I shouted, or I tried to. What came out of my mouth wasn't a voice. It was a cloud of white spores. I looked at the jars again. One of them, a large, empty one near the center, was sliding toward me across the shelf. It was waiting. It had my name on it now. Arthur, the final entry. I realized then that the Vanderwalls hadn't disappeared. They hadn't died. They were in the jars. The liver of a liar wasn't a trophy. It was a fragment of a person who had been dismantled by this house. The house didn't want my soul. It wanted my structure. It wanted to turn my memories into patterns, my love into a color, my fear into a shape. I felt my mind starting to slip. I couldn't remember my mother's face. It was being replaced by a hexagon. I couldn't remember the smell of rain. It was being replaced by a cold, metallic taste. I was losing the human parts of me. But then, I saw it. The camera, the one I dropped. The lens was cracked, and the white mold was thick on the casing. But the internal light, the little red rec light, was still blinking. A tiny, digital heartbeat in a world of ancient, stone-cold mysticism. The house could categorize my flesh. It could categorize my bones. But it didn't understand the artificial. It didn't understand the silicon and the sensors. It was a gap in the geometry. I forced my arm to move. It felt like moving a limb made of solid lead. The skin on my shoulder tore, a dry, paper-like sound, but I didn't feel it. I reached for the camera. If I could record the pattern, if I could capture the frequency of the house, maybe I could feed it back. But as my fingers touched the plastic, the book on the podium slammed shut. The light in the jars went out. The silence returned. And in the dark, I felt something that wasn't a jar, something that wasn't a book. I felt a hand, a cold, damp hand, holding mine. "Don't," a voice whispered, a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "It's much tidier this way." The hand holding mine didn't let go. It didn't squeeze, it just held, like a dead weight. I didn't have the strength to pull away. My muscles felt like they were being replaced by the same cold porcelain as the jars. I fumbled for my lighter with my free hand, the hand that wasn't fused to a shadow. The flint sparked. Once. Twice. The flame was small, a pathetic orange flicker in the oppressive gloom. But it was enough. I looked at the person holding my hand. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was me. But it was a me that had been finished. The skin was perfectly smooth, like polished marble. The eyes were gone, replaced by two perfectly round, black obsidian spheres. The mouth was sewn shut with silver wire in a geometric pattern, a star with 12 points. It stood there, a silent, perfected version of my own decay. I tried to scream, but the white spores in my throat turned the sound into a dry hiss. "Who are you?" I managed to wheeze. The thing didn't speak. It couldn't. But the jars on the shelves began to vibrate in unison. 1,000 glass containers humming a single, resonant chord. The draft, the jars whispered. "You are the draft. He is the final copy." The mysticism of the Vanderwalls was a meat grinder for the soul. They didn't want to transcend humanity. They wanted to refine it until it was nothing but a static, unchanging object. A piece of art for a gallery that had no visitors. My twin reached up with its other hand. It touched my cheek. Its fingers were freezing, colder than ice. Where it touched, my skin didn't just turn white. It T-R-E-N-S-B-R-E-N-T-I-Z-E-D. I could see my own jawbone. I could see the pulse in my neck, slow and sluggish like thick oil. I wasn't dying. Dying is a process of release. This was a process of entrapment. I looked at the camera on the floor. The red rec light was still blinking. 1% battery. If I could just... I kicked the camera. It wasn't a graceful move. My leg felt like a pillar of salt, but it skidded across the bronze plates, right toward the bone podium. The me, with the obsidian eyes, tilted its head. It didn't understand. The camera hit the base of the podium. The jar labeled Arthur. The final entry teetered on the edge of the shelf above it. The house wanted symmetry. It wanted order. I reached out and did the only thing that wasn't in the book. I did something messy, something unplanned. I spat. A glob of gray, spore-filled phlegm hit the vellum pages of the open book. The reaction was instant. The house screamed. The sound wasn't a noise. It was a tearing. The bronze plates on the walls began to buckle. The perfect geometric lines etched into the metal started to bleed. Not blood, but that black, swirling ink. It poured out of the walls like a flood, drowning the floor. The symmetry was broken. My twin, the marble version of me, stiffened. Its obsidian eyes began to crack. A high-pitched, crystalline shriek erupted from the silver-wired mouth. I felt the weight on my legs vanish. The fusion between my boots and the floor snapped. I stumbled back, my skin burning as the white mold began to flake off in great, bloody chunks. Pain. Beautiful, human pain. I lunged for the camera. The ink was rising. It was up to my knees now. It felt like wading through freezing mercury. The jars on the shelves were exploding, one by one. Pop, pop, pop. Teeth sprayed across the room like shrapnel. Hair tangled in the air like black cobwebs. The last breath of Maria V. escaped its jar with a sound like a dying flute. The house was rejecting the disorder. Or maybe it was trying to swallow everything to hide the mistake. I grabbed the camera. I pointed the lens of the bone podium at the ruined book, at the chaos of the ink. "Record this," I yelled. I pressed the button to play back the last 10 seconds of what the camera had seen. The small LCD screen flickered to life. It showed the room, but not as I saw it. The camera didn't see the mysticism. It didn't see the final copy of me. The camera saw noise, digital artifacts, static, a mess of unorganized data that the house's geometry couldn't categorize. I held the screen up to the final copy. "Look at yourself," I roared. The marble thing looked at the screen. It saw the static. It saw the imperfection. The contradiction was too much. The creature began to dissolve, not into dust, but into raw data. Its body turned into a flickering mass of gray pixels and white noise. It wasn't part of the system anymore. It was a glitch. The floor beneath me groaned. The house was shaking. I didn't have a door. I didn't have an exit. But as the final copy vanished, the wall where it had stood began to fracture. It wasn't a portal. It was a crack in the reality of the house. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just ran. I threw myself into the fracture. The camera clutched to my chest like a holy relic. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the sound of 1,000 glass jars, shattering at once. I didn't fall into a void. I didn't wake up in a hospital. I hit the floor of the hallway hard. The air was thick with the smell of wet plaster and something like burnt hair. My lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. Every breath was a stab of reality. I looked back. The door to the study wasn't there. Just a solid, unbroken wall of peeling Victorian wallpaper. No bolts, no handle, no fracture. But I wasn't alone in the hall. The silence of the house had changed. It wasn't a wait anymore. It was a cough, a rhythmic, wet sound coming from the shadows at the end of the corridor. I looked at my hands. The white mold was gone, but the skin was wrong. It looked like a low-resolution photograph. The pores were blurred. The lines of my palms didn't connect. I was a glitch in the flesh. The camera in my hand was hot. The plastic was melting, fusing with my skin. The red light wasn't blinking anymore. It was a solid, angry streak of crimson. "Arthur." The voice didn't come from the hallway. It came from the camera's speaker. I looked at the tiny LCD screen. It wasn't showing the room anymore. It was showing a skeleton, a perfect digital rendering of a human frame. But the ribs were shaped like the jars from the basement. "Arthur, we are missing a component." I threw the camera. It hit the wall and shattered, but the screen stayed lit, lying on the floor. "The liver of a liar," the screen whispered. "The heart of a hero, the eyes of an observer." I scrambled to my feet. My legs were shaking. The hallway seemed to stretch. The perspective was warping. The far end of the hall looked miles away, while the ceiling felt like it was inches from my scalp. This wasn't a portal. This was the house recalibrating. It was trying to find a new way to measure me. I ran toward the stairs. My boots made a sound like drum beats on the floorboards. Thud, thud, thud. But the stairs, they weren't going down. I climbed a flight. I reached the landing. I looked down. I was higher. I climbed another. I looked down again. I was back at the entrance to the study. The house was a loop, a closed circuit of architectural mysticism. I wasn't moving in space. I was moving in a sequence, and the sequence always led back to the start. I stopped running. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. If I couldn't leave through the doors, if I couldn't leave through the stairs, I had to leave through the logic. The Vanderwalls didn't build a house. They built a thought, and a thought can be broken if you introduce a contradiction. I walked back to the spot where the camera lay. The screen was still glowing. "What do you want?" I yelled at the walls. The walls didn't answer, but the wallpaper began to peel back in long, wet strips. Underneath, there were no bricks. There were no beams. There were letters, millions of tiny, handwritten words, covering every inch of the house's skeleton. I leaned closer. Arthur felt cold at 3:14 p.m. Arthur's first fear was a spider in a bathtub. Arthur thinks he is escaping. The house wasn't just cataloging my body. It was cataloging my existence. It was writing me into its history. I was becoming a chapter in the Vanderwall estate. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. I looked down. A word was forming on my skin, just above my heart. N-O, I hissed. I reached into my pocket. My fingers found the only thing I had left. A small, silver pocket knife I used for prying labels off antiques. I didn't attack the walls. I didn't attack the shadows. I looked at the word on my chest. N. If the house was writing me, I had to be the editor. I opened the blade. The steel felt real. It felt sharp. It was the only thing in this house that had a purpose other than being ordered. I pressed the tip of the blade to my skin. I didn't cut deep. I just altered the letter. I turned the E into a B. I turned the N into an E. I turned the D into a J. Beg. The house shuddered. A sound of grinding stone erupted from the floorboards. The wallpaper began to smoke. The words on the walls started to scramble. Arthur is. Begging. Arthur is. Beginning. The logic was fracturing. The house didn't know how to categorize a change in the script. It was a machine that only knew how to record, not how to adapt. The hallway began to tilt. The floor became a wall. The wall became a ceiling. I was falling, not through a portal, but through the collapse of system. I saw the front door. It was right above me. It was glowing with a pale, gray light of a rainy morning. I reached for it, but as my fingers touched the handle, I felt a hand on my ankle, a hand made of glass and old paper. Arthur, it whispered, don't leave the collection. You're the only piece that's alive. The hand on my ankle wasn't just holding me. It was absorbing me. I looked down and saw my own skin turning into the same yellowed vellum as the book. The letters from the walls were migrating onto my leg, crawling like ink-black insects. Arthur is leaving. Arthur's broken. No, I roared. The sound felt like it was tearing my throat out. I didn't use the knife on the hand. I used it on myself. I slashed the skin of my own calf. Not deep enough to hit the artery, but enough to let the blood flow. The blood wasn't black. It was bright, vivid red. The house recoiled. The mysticism of the Vanderwalls couldn't handle fluidity. It wanted things dry. It wanted things preserved. It wanted things dead. The blood hit the vellum hand, and the paper began to SOG. The letters blurred. The grip loosened. I lunged for the door handle. It was cold, real, metallic. I twisted. The door didn't open into the yard. It opened into a mirror. I saw myself, but it wasn't the marble twin. It was me, covered in dust, bleeding, eyes wide with a terror that no geometry could ever map. And behind me, I saw the house. It wasn't a Victorian mansion anymore. It was a giant, pulsing lung made of wood and glass. It was breathing. Every timber was a rib. Every window was an eye. You cannot leave the catalog. The house groaned. The sound came from the floorboards, the ceiling, and the very air. Everything must have a place. I didn't look back. I threw my shoulder against the mirror, against my own reflection. The glass didn't shatter. It ripped. I felt a sensation of being pulled through a needle's eye. My bones ground together. My vision turned into a kaleidoscope of red and gray. Then, impact. Cold, wet grass. The smell of rain. The sound of a distant car engine. I was outside. I lay there for a long time, my face pressed into the dirt. I didn't move. I didn't want to know if the house was still there. Finally, I looked up. The Vanderwall estate was gone. In its place was a scorched patch of earth. No ruins. No wood. Just a perfect black circle of ash. But as I looked at my hands, I realized the price. My fingerprints were gone. My palms were as smooth as glass. The house hadn't let me go. It had just finished the entry. It's been 6 months since I stood in the Blackwood Valley. I live in a small apartment now. No mirrors. No glass. I've covered the windows with heavy curtains. The doctors say it's trauma-induced sensory distortion. They give me pills to stop the humming in my teeth. They tell me my skin condition is a rare form of dermatitis. They're wrong. I don't have a heartbeat anymore. Not a real one. When I press my ear to my chest, I don't hear a thump-thump. I hear a crinkle, like paper being turned. I've stopped eating. I don't feel hunger. I just feel empty, like a jar that's waiting to be filled. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake in the dark, is the noise. Every night, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the walls of my apartment start to rustle. I can see the outlines of letters forming under the paint. Arthur is waiting. Arthur is nearly ready. I realized something today. Something that the book in the basement didn't say, but the silence implied. You don't escape the mysticism. You just take it with you. The house didn't need the walls. It didn't need the bronze plates. It just needed an observer. I'm the house now. I'm the catalog. And as I sit here, writing this, I can feel my fingers getting stiff. I can see my skin turning white. I'm not a man anymore. I'm a preservation. I'm reaching for my camera now. The one I took from the house. The one that shouldn't work. The red light is blinking. It's recording you. Because a catalog always needs a second entry. Do you feel it yet? I whisper to the lens. The weight of the silence. I can see you through the screen. You're leaning in. You're listening. And now, you're part of the collection.